Welcome to Inking Neon, episode 3. We're going to be talking about antagonists today. I'm here with Stuart J. Tanner, and I am Cullen McHael.
Antagonists. Big subject, very important subject. Oh my goodness me. The importance of the antagonist.
One time I was traveling in Europe with a traveling circus. And we were pushing, we had, I forget the name of the city that we were in. We'd been in a dozen cities in a dozen days, and I don't remember which city this was in, but it had two train stations. And we had mistakenly booked our second train on the second train station, and they were 10 miles apart. So we arrived at about 11 o'clock at night to the first train station and discovered that the last bus had already gone to the second train station. And our train was to leave at about 4 a.m, so we had enough time to walk. And we had these two gigantic chests full of circus equipment that we had to push on wheels. We decided to walk 10 miles through this unknown city. And as we're walking along, the road is starting to get darker with fewer and fewer streetlights and more iron bars on the windows. And we noticed that one of the members of our troupe had fallen behind us and was walking alone. And two men passed us and fell in beside her and started chatting with her. So we all slowed down to let her catch up. And these two men were total strangers, and they introduced themselves in French, which I could not speak, to say that the way we were going to get to the train station was very dangerous, but they would show us a safe way to do it. And so we exchanged a few glances by which we reached a consensus to trust them. And they led us not along the road that we had picked on the map, but off through a residential neighborhood. And as we went, the number of bars on the windows continued to go up. The number of streetlights continued to go down. The amount of graffiti continued to go up. We went through these communities where there are no rear view mirrors on the parked cars. You know the type. And as we went, things got more and more tense, and these two that were leading us just they were just exuding an air of intense faux calm. Just trying to look calm as they smiled with very evident nerves. And then we round the corner, and there's this vast playground full of probably 1,000 teenagers. Bear in mind, it is now 1 a.m. and about 1,000 teenagers with no adults in a playground in the middle of the city. They exchanged a few words with the men leading us, and we kept walking. And then we came to the end of the road. The road literally ended under a 4-lane highway. No streetlights, no turnaround, just a dead-end road under the highway overpass, broken bottles, glass strewn across the street, and around the corner behind us zooms a rusted-out minivan, which skids to a halt, and a bunch of people jump out. And then the two guys got in the van and they said, "Okay, you're safe," and drove away. After some discussion, we figured out that the 6-lane highway above us, the 4-lane highway above us, led to the train station. So we pushed our baggage up onto the highway, walked down the rest of the way, and there was the train station. And it turns out they were not antagonists. But the question was very much on our minds the whole way. Are they friend or are they foe?
And you know, it would have been a much better story if they had been antagonists, which is our point. Basically, the story where, and actually, they were just genuinely being friendly. And although they took us to a dark place, we just got up on the road and caught our plane home. Ta-da!
Success. And
Which
yet,
is great for you. I'm very happy that it worked out that way.
Right. I'm very glad that those men did not.
I sure as shit would not read it or watch it as a film.
I'm very happy that those men did not try to drag us into their rusted out minivan. I'm uncertain if there was in fact danger on that route that they helped us escape. Perhaps there was. Perhaps we were headed through risky territory and they walked us around it. Perhaps all those teenagers in that park would have bullied or harassed us as we made our way through if they hadn't been there with us.
Yeah.
I'll never know.
You'll
But
never know. What I do know is that the story that was written and the film that was made wasn't about you. It was about the people who took the other route and weren't rescued, and what happened to them. Hopefully they survived and they were okay and it all worked out. But nonetheless, they ran
so
in
the
antagonists.
the role of the antagonist in the story is to create tension. And not every story has to involve violent conflict with the antagonist, of course. You can have romantic comedies with antagonists and political dramas with antagonists and so on and so on. But that role, there is a kind of antagonist where throughout the story you are asking whether they are friend or they are foe. That is one kind of antagonist. We're going to go through 9 variations on antagonist and kind of give some advice about the different variations of antagonist and what kind of story they tend to create. But I just wanted to say that right out of the gate, the first thing that I always decide when I'm getting ready to prepare a story is who is the antagonist going to be. If you decide on an antagonist, you decide what motivates them, where their lines are, what they believe in, what they love, what brings them happiness, then you can pretty much kick your protagonist in their direction, get your protagonist hooked on whatever problem they are creating, and sit back and watch the fireworks. Deciding on an antagonist decides on the story.
Yeah, I mean that's really true and a very good point, and it speaks to the role of a antagonist. So you think about an antagonist and you think, well, this is the opposition with the story, and it has many layers to it, and on its deepest level, one of the reasons why if you focused on the antagonist first, it's actually telling you what the themes in the story are going to be quite a lot, because they're going to represent what is going to be the opposition to the main character, and that opposition can be on many different levels. They're like a mirror character in a way to the antagonist, to the protagonist, and so they're going to pose the situational, moral, physical, and other kind of problems and challenges that the protagonist, your main character, is going to come across. So they speak to a lot of the important content in the film, and I think if you're talking about science fiction and fantasy particularly, then they are going to be representative of the world's issues, its particular kind of challenges and conflicts, an embodiment of that to the greatest degree. Obviously, there's going to be lesser versions of that as well, and so yeah, that really helps you as a writer set up, like you said, what the story is going to be about. So that's a really key aspect of the antagonist, that they perform, like they play that role within the story, which is why they're so critically important, and it's so vital that they are, perform that really well and offer a powerful opposition to the main character.
So, Stuart, would you like to start us off with a few examples of really compelling antagonists?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna start with something of my favorite version, or one of my favorite versions of the antagonist. Right. And the 2 examples I'm going to use are the Joker in The Dark Knight, and I can hear everybody going, "Oh yeah, the Joker in The Dark Knight," and then Magneto, right, in X-Men also. And they speak to the reason why I've chosen those and that particular form of the antagonist, because, and I'm sure you've heard it before, that in order to make a antagonist interesting, they need not to be just pure bad, pure evil, one-dimensional, and that really doesn't sort of test the main character particularly, but more importantly, that it doesn't really ask any questions either. And that's the really interesting thing about those 2 antagonists that I've chosen, and that type of antagonist. I think Roy in Blade Runner would be another one, actually, the same kind of type of antagonist. And what are they doing? Well, they actually, in a way, they they are exposing the society that they live in, and they are asking deep questions in a way. It's not simply that they're being the villain. They're actually asking, in essence, some pretty legitimate questions that have some real force behind them. And the best thing of all about those antagonists is that they might be right. If you think about it, right? There's a wonderful speech with the Joker in The Dark Knight where he's in a prison cell and Batman comes in and he talks to Batman. I would love to play that clip, actually.
Never start with the head. The victim gets all fuzzy. He can't feel the neck. See?
You wanted me. Here I am.
I wanted to see what you'd do. And you didn't disappoint. You let 5 people die. Then you let Dent take your place. Even to a guy like me, that's cold.
Where's Dent?
Those mob fools want you gone so they can get back to the way things were. But I know the truth. There's no going back. You've changed things. Forever.
Then why'd you want to kill me?
I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No. No, you complete me.
You're garbage. You kills for money.
Don't talk like one of them. You're not. Even if you'd like to be. To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. But when they don't, they'll cast you out. Like a leper. See, their morals, their code. It's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
The beauty of that, which is captured in that, in there, obviously there's more, is a couple of things. One is the Joker might be right, okay? I mean, in terms of the people in power, what really is the bottom line of their motives and stuff. If you think about it as a commentary on the current politics, current situation, and so on, right? I mean, he's talking about like you're just going to be you'll never be accepted. You'll always be treated as a freak and really ostracized and so on.
He also effectively, if subtextually, highlights that Batman is just a violent vigilante and really not that different from Joker, which an astute observer will begin to question. How useful is it really to have a violent vigilante running around beating people up without due process? In fact, it's not useful at all. That is illegal and should be illegal. There isn't that much of a difference. The Joker's the killing joke, so to speak, to reference the comics. The Joker's relationship to Batman is so compelling because he really is a good dark mirror of the Dark Knight.
Well,
and because he does a really good job of commenting on the fundamental paradox of the main character and of society that venerates him.
So in that sense, I think a good antagonist, a really good antagonist, is able to really get inside a main character and really pull them in a powerful way in different directions and ask some pretty powerful questions. It's almost as if, and I can think of many examples, like, Darth Vader, Magneto. They were once what the main character is, or they could have been, but they've gone to the dark side, but there's compelling reasons why. Not to the same extent with every great antagonist, But that's what gives it foundation. The worst kind of antagonist is someone who just comes across as fully formed in their badness, and you have an example of that from a recent movie. And there's no establishment, there's no foundation, there's nothing really, interesting about them and what their questioning is and what their
You're right.
what their compass is in the situation and stuff. So they're not posing any interesting questions. They might pose some challenges with their fights that in terms of what they want to do and their ambition and stuff. But there's nothing of substance beyond that. Whereas
Before we move into failed antagonists,
yeah,
let's just quickly summarize. We've talked about a couple of examples of great antagonists: Magneto and the Joker, baddies, Roy Batty from Blade Runner, a few other examples, as being interesting for their ability to extract from the narrative strong ideological, psychological commentary on the protagonist's character and on the society that they are operating in. So those are some really good examples of that kind of antagonist. And then let's look at a couple of examples of antagonists who don't achieve, who might ruin a story, or who do not, at the very least, do not achieve greatness. I would start with the most recent Superman movie. Now, I preface this by saying that I'm a huge Superman nerd. I think Superman might be my favorite comic book hero, although I think probably the Superman that is the Supergirl from the TV show is a little closer to what I would idolize. But in general, I think Lex Luthor has the potential to be an incredibly good foil to Superman. But the latest Superman movie was like very nearly ruined for me by their depiction of Lex Luthor. And where to me it failed was in his total lack of an ideological lens. He didn't make a point that wouldn't motivate anyone to follow him. And yet everything he did depended on mass numbers of people actually following him. He was incapable of doing anything without his armies of minions, and yet he could not make a compelling point for why these armies of minions should be loyal to him. Despite much effort, much long-winded effort, very distracting and boring monologuing ceaselessly through every scene. So you can go wrong in the simple way of having a character say things that characters wouldn't, that no human would say. And of course, any character will fail if they're just on the nose dialogue is what Hollywood calls it, is when you're just like saying things because the audience needs to hear them, not because a human being would actually say them under these circumstances. And there was a lot of that in that script. But protagonists, but that will kill any character regardless of who they are. An antagonist can really fail if they don't have a point to make, if they're that kind of antagonist, if they depend on other people following them, right? If they don't depend on other people following, like Sauron doesn't need to make a point. He doesn't need to have an ideology. He's so powerful that his forces will do his will regardless of what he orders, and their own self-preservation has nothing to do with their will. He doesn't need to convince them of anything. So there are different kinds of antagonists, but that would be my first example of a failed antagonist. I think that Lex Luthor in the Superman movie from 2025 was a failure. Have you got some other examples?
Yeah, Sauron's an interesting one. Some people think there's a lot of build up without a lot of, delivery in the end. I think it's different. I think it's a different type of antagonist, just as you were saying.
I'm going to get into in a minute. I'm going to get into 9 different kinds of antagonists, and maybe we can categorize some of our examples.
And I'd say that was a kind of antagonist. So I'm not entirely sure that I think that I agree that it's a problematic one because of the representation of the force of Sauron in other ways within the film and so on. I think you can find many examples. I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, probably. I think the last Mad Max movie, Furiosa, what started off as pretty compelling antagonist. Actually, I felt it was solid, good build-up, interesting main
I
character
agree.
challenges and all, great situation, and then the final, and this is so important, even if you do have a great antagonist and they are interesting, and the dynamic there between the paternal role but not, and what was going on, complex, pretty interesting, and it played out pretty well. But I would say the final, like 10, 15 minutes and so on, there was no real delivery in terms of what had been set up um, uh, for the antagonist. It sort of resolved itself pretty quickly. I wouldn't say entirely easily, but not in a satisfactory way. I didn't find, if you build up and you do all that work, and you sort of, everything is suggesting that this is going to be, quite a big kind of problem to solve, a big conflict, a sort of a real clash of the forces that have been slugging it out and everything. You really have to deliver on that. And I don't think it did, personally.
It's an interesting case. I tend to agree with you about Furiosa. I think, what's his name? George Miller, the writer and director of the Mad Max films, including that one, is a hell of a storyteller. So great respect to George Miller. He did many things very right in terms of setting up an interesting antagonist. I don't think it's the fault of the actor. I forget his name. Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah, Hemsworth. Yeah.
Is that who it was? Yeah. I don't think it's his fault either. I think he did a fine job with the script that he put together. And yet somehow that film just doesn't quite deliver, does it?
No.
It's full of really cool ideas, but the narrative thought doesn't quite achieve a coherence. And I think that I would place that in this case on it just not being that coherent of a narrative thought to begin with, compared to Mad Max Fury Road, which is such a tight, concise statement.
Yeah.
A 90-minute, we go out, we come back, that's the story, right? And then Furiosa is this sort of winding and slightly confused narrative, which fails to build to a rhythm of a final climax that really delivers on the villain character,
on the promise that you set up. And I would say that is, a critical feature of the antagonist experience. If you set up, a great antagonist, an interesting antagonist, and particularly in speculative fiction, we're talking about sci-fi and fantasy. I mean, it's hugely important. And when we bear in mind, we are talking primarily about the speculative fiction arena.
Right.
But it applies outside of that, but principally it's about that. Then you have to deliver on it. And, there are a number of times I felt the antagonist disappointment where, almost they put you in a situation where you're also rooting for the antagonist. You almost want them to survive and not to sort of be conquered easily, and that it should be incredibly difficult. It does take an awful lot of sacrifice and problem solving and, cost for the main character and so on. And boy, if you don't deliver on that, and it sort of like resolves quickly, or it just doesn't deliver on the promise that you've set up, then I will experience, and many others, I think, the antagonist letdown, as it were. That this great force and character and all the rest of it is just like petered out. Not maybe entirely, but in terms of the promise that was there, it's not being delivered on. So that's a very critical thing about delivering on the antagonist that you set up.
And I think, as with fight scenes, delivering on that antagonist kind of boils down to understanding the appeal of the antagonist and what it will take to satisfy your audience's expectations about that antagonist.
Hmm.
So there are different kinds of antagonists, and maybe now's a good time to go through my categories.
Hmm.
As with any categorization, these categories are loose, and you often check more than one box when designing a character. But the 9 that I've come up with, and maybe Stuart, you can You can comment on them and add to them or strike some. But the framework I've come up with is I've got 9 kinds of antagonists, and each one of them needs to be treated a little differently. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of categories of antagonist to try to be useful to authors, because I have made the mistake of looking at an antagonist and trying to weave them into the story to fit a kind of narrative about them that wasn't quite right. And so I want to give some more kind of practical advice about thinking about what your antagonist is doing in the story and how to address it. So here we go. 9 kinds. I'm going to just name them first, and then we'll go through what they are. Fallen hero, competitor hero, an evil mask. I've struggled to name this one, but I'm going to call it an evil mask for now. Hero bully, corrupt priest, unstoppable force, and shadow, veiled beast, and hostile environment. These are all very different from each other. So starting from the bottom and going backward through them. Number 9, hostile environment. This is Apollo 13 or Touching the Void. This is not a story about humans or basically people-shaped beings causing the antagonistic situation. This is a story about people overcoming a hostile environment. That can be very, very compelling. Apollo 13 is one of my favorite movies and something I come back to really regularly as a reminder that there is a school of thinking in Hollywood that manufactures problems by having characters be cruddy to each other instead of just building an interesting premise. Sometimes the problem is bad enough that it takes everything we've got to solve it, and you don't have to make it worse by having people be cruddy to each other. That's rare, but it's definitely a thing. And those stories can be compelling too. So hostile environment. I'm going to try to be concise and say what I mean by these 9 things, and then maybe we can discuss them a little bit. 8, wild beast. Sometimes it's a werewolf or a monster in the night, a tiger. It doesn't have an ideology. It represents something in the wild world, something that is uncontrollable, that needs to be tamed or conquered. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's not always a person. Sometimes it's a beast, the alien and aliens. A grand shadow. This is my name for the Saurons of fiction. These faceless entities which cast a shadow over all the universe. And you could see the story as a Beowulfian monster hunt, but they're not going to be tearing Sauron's arm off. Sauron is far too vast for that. It is more of a force of nature than a person with an agenda. An unstoppable force. This is my name for the Jason of horror film. This is a relentless thing that the characters must escape that is inevitably always more about purity, morality than it is about social commentary or some kind of, it's always about punishment. Those unstoppable forces are always about punishment. 5, a corrupt priest. Some ideas are so dangerous that the people who share them are going to cause problems, and you can have a villain who strongly believes one of those ideas and represents it, whether through a cult or whatever. They are not their goals are not the problem. They are fundamental. They may seem in every respect a holy person, a good person, but because they cleave to an idea that is extremely dangerous, they are causing problems for the world. Pure bullies are pretty straightforward. We've all met bullies. Sometimes that is enough on its own. Some people are just bullies. Actually, a lot of people. A lot of people. The evil mask is the one that I've struggled to name, and this is a category of villain who has been labeled by society in a particular way and has chosen to inhabit the darkest aspect of that as a way to get back at society, to just take on the mask of evil and wear it proudly. You see this in history with figures like Pablo Escobar. They're often highly visible in entertainment industries. People who just decide that they are in fact evil and they're going to be evil the best they can as a giant middle finger to society. This is kind of an opposite to an idea that I've held most of my life, which is that most people who do really evil things think they're doing the right thing. they think they're doing it for a good reason, like the corrupt priest. But some people, society has so often told them that they're evil, told their class of people that they're evil, that they just decide, you know what, I guess I will be. And then there's the competitor hero, an antagonist who is in fact honorable, but is working for someone else, who's essentially a hero, but is not on your side. And that can make a really compelling antagonist. And then the fallen hero is, of course, pretty self-explanatory. That is a protagonist who has become jaded and sold out in some capacity.
Turn to the dark side of the Force.
Right.
Yeah, they're particularly compelling, I think. Okay, so one of my other favorite, that's a good summary, and that's a great summary of the different types of antagonists, because obviously there are many. And so here's a question. One of the, what's an antagonist that you remember that really spooked you, that really you were genuinely afraid of, right? That really kind of got to you. And because often, let's be honest, two things are true about antagonists. One is that usually when a great antagonist walks into the room, basically your interest level goes higher, even quite often, than for the main character.
Oh, yes.
Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker.
Right. To say nothing of somebody like Boba Fett, whose claim to fame is that he has interesting armor, and yet everyone wants him to be the most interesting person in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
So
it takes charisma to be properly evil.
Right. And actually that's part of the origins. Sometimes people start by writing an antagonist, and then they love their antagonist so much that they actually become the main character. That can happen.
It can. There's also a thing that tends to happen in sort of liberal democracies where people become middle class enough that they have a hard time identifying with those who want to challenge the system or the status quo. So you tend to see movie after movie, book after book, where the villain is the only one who's really got an idea of something that needs to change about the world.
Yes. And that's playing the role of the rebel. That's another thing that is interesting about, great antagonists, is that they ask genuine questions. And there's actually quite a lot of force behind those questions. They tend to be extreme in their solutions, but they ask the question, when is it so bad that actually being extreme is something that it becomes acceptable. It's
Right.
not an argument for it. It's just that this is what they're examining. Okay. So, they ask really potent questions like that. But I'm just, my question was like, who is that antagonist that's really done that for you? Because I can name one, and that would be.
Yeah, I can name a couple. So antagonists that really spook you fit one category. Sometimes antagonists are more charming than spooky, and that can be another category. One antagonist that sticks with me and is someone that I often find myself thinking about is a character from an anime called Monster. There's a character named Johan in the anime called Monster, who is maybe the devil, but it's not clear. There's no like overt supernatural overlay. He's just a person who has incredible charisma and uses it for evil. And everywhere he goes, he's super charismatic and people love him, but he is not a good person.
Yeah.
And that is terrifying.
Yeah, that creates a huge kind of dynamic tension there. So I have one as well, and that would be Nurse Ratchet.
There you go. Yep.
From One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
If you haven't seen that, do watch it. As an antagonist force and character, my goodness me, she genuinely made me afraid. Definitely. I really felt afraid. She really sort of like got to me in a very powerful way. Incredibly good antagonist. Because she's calm, controlled, and she's inflicting this psychological force. And that can
She
be one of the worst forces to face, is a
she
psychological.
genuinely believes
Oh.
what she's doing is the right thing.
Yeah.
Right? She's here to help.
Yeah. Well, she thinks she is, but then she plays on everybody's weaknesses, and
Right.
she's got the power of drugs, and she's given the control by the state, and you know, the
immense
sets
authoritarian power.
Yeah, it sets up an opposition. McMurphy is the sort of the opposite pole of the messy humanity, free, expressive, lot of life force, natural rebellion and stuff, which you love, of course. And then there's this terrible, like, controlling, oppressive force that smiles as it quietly sort of crushes you. That was definitely one of the great sort of, for me, antagonists in a film that really did get through, you know.
I would categorize her in the bully category.
Yeah.
But here I need to expand my definition of bully a little bit, because I know that I'm working from a rubric that I don't think is universal. I do a fair amount of reading, and I've done some consulting in domestic violence as a space. And one of the things that we learn is that the same tools of coercive force that are used in domestic violence identically are used by governments to control their populations. There is no difference between authoritarianism and domestic abuse. It's just a question of scale.
Right.
And so I see Nurse Ratchet as an excellent example of state authoritarianism. She is empowered with absolute control over these people. She thinks she's helping them, but really she's doing it for her own gratification and power. And that is a symptom of the entitlement that underpins bullying, which is a simple word for a whole complex of entitlement that leads to coercive control through very regular mechanisms. I think I would call it bullying.
And then, you know, another great example of that, but it's become the whole society, is 1984, George Orwell. And oh my gosh, the prescience of that book to a certain extent, with you know, the way that everything starts to shape your thinking, and you have to speak in the right way and use the right terms and have the right thoughts, and you know, you're under surveillance all the time, is extraordinary, and it exists in the world. You know, it does exist in the world.
Hannah Arendt was one of the great thinkers on authoritarianism, and she made the comment that authoritarianism is what happens when the state successfully erases the line between public and private life. When the state can see everything that you do and judge you for it. So no one can withstand that kind of scrutiny. That gives the state infinite authority to punish as it sees fit. That's exactly what's happening with Nurse Ratchet and in 1984. They have total visibility into the lives that they are controlling.
And here's a spooky thought. You know, TikTok is now going to be bought by a new conglomerate and stuff, involving American companies and something. So everything will be shifted here, and the algorithm, to quote, will be adjusted and changed. And how will it be adjusted? How will it be changed? What will be the result of that in terms of what gets allowed, what gets featured? I mean, there is a sneaky suspicion here that the you know, censorship will creep in.
I'm not even, censorship is not the thing that worries me. I mean, there is an element of censorship, of course. So I guess I should give in context that part of my day job, besides writing sci-fi, I also write a privacy and security newsletter with a pretty significant circulation, and we've been following it very closely. So one of the things that they do adjust the algorithm, and censorship is part of the problem, but the other part of the problem is what they choose to feature.
Well, that's
so the algorithm doesn't just silence people, it also amplifies people.
Yeah.
And that is the Chinese state is explicit about their use of the tools to do these things. That is not hidden. It is also done with Facebook, with X, with all of the social media platforms that have become major tech industries. They do that too. Facebook absolutely does tune their algorithms to favor one side over another in political discourse. They have that power and they use it. The difference is that Facebook is a company, whereas the People's Republic of China has an outside interest beyond. They don't live here.
I mean,
so,
and also the surveillance level in China is extraordinary. I mean,
right. And that is explicit. That is what they wanted.
Getting
so
points
when
for good social behavior, being
right.
deducted sort of points for anything that's not considered to be good behavior and so on. It's like,
so that total visibility.
That's where the world of 1984 starts to become a reality. That's the amazing thing, right? Science fiction. This is why we love it in a way. And, you know, we're talking about antagonists, but we're talking about antagonists, you know, who kick up the dust, right? That's part of what they do. That's why they're interesting. I mean,
right.
They may represent going to an extreme, going too far, going over the edge.
Well, they must, or else they would be the protagonist rather than the antagonist, right?
Picking the wrong solution. But that's why they pose such powerful questions and challenges for the protagonist, because the protagonist could be tempted themselves. They could be pulled in that direction. Maybe they will be to a certain extent. You know, that push and pull is a really interesting aspect of the whole thing.
And I think that's true. So we've made at this point, I think we've repeatedly made the point that what makes a fight scene compelling, what makes an antagonist compelling, what makes a protagonist compelling is the underlying ideology. So I think that's true across all the different categories of antagonists that we've just talked about. Fallen heroes are interesting in how they show optimism giving way to cynicism. They are interesting in how they could be potentially redeemed. They are interesting in the way that they demonstrate how society corrupts the best intentions and how best intentions pave the road to hell, so to speak. Competitor heroes are always interesting because oftentimes the other team that they're fighting for is either going to have a really strong ideological difference, or sometimes they don't even. Like some of the best antagonists come from franchises or stories where the two sides are indistinguishable. And so you have this sort of, we're against each other, but we respect each other because we both know what we're fighting for, right? That can become a really interesting relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I particularly like that. And I have to say, that's one of my things I find super appealing, is where you have the rival hierarchy structures. So, for instance, a good example of that would be The Wire. You have two hierarchies, you know, criminal and drug world and the police, and they're mirroring each other very powerfully all the way through with, you know, both a moral code, and then the breakdown of code and corruption, and, you know, each one thinking they're surviving and doing the right thing, and yet they're in opposition within themselves and to each other. And boy, does that make for a rich mix if you have, and great characters.
It really isn't that different. When you get into like Omerta, the mafia code, their belief structure about what they're doing as a mafia isn't that different from the belief structure that the police have about what they're doing to protect their people. There is a certain element of fundamental tribalism that can put people at loggerheads with each other because they view social resource and safety as a zero-sum game. And that can result in a really interesting clash. Lots of history, like I'm thinking of the 100 Years' War between England and France, right? The English nobility during the 100 Year War were French. So the difference between them is there isn't a difference. And yet 100 years of war. And so we get all of this complexity and human tragedy and compelling experience that folds out from factions that really don't ideologically have much of a difference between them. So that's kind of an opposite. So we've been saying that you need to have ideological differences. That ideology underpinning your antagonist's actions really brings out some complex thoughts, helps you elaborate on themes, adds richness and depth, and it does. But it's not the only way to do it, right? You don't actually, like, sometimes they have the same ideology, and the difference between them is just who is fighting for, who wants it, and the zero-sum game that they are trapped in. But I think that if you only do that, it will tend to feel very cynical. I think in any meaningful conflict, people will identify differences between themselves. Almost all culture is defined in opposition. We define ourselves by what we are not. So you will see that ideological distinctions arise between your different factions when you're designing them.
Yeah. Well, we're probably close to, this has been great going through the gears with.
It's true. We're at 50 minutes. We're coming to the end of our hour.
I mean, one thing I want to do is say that, that what makes the greatest antagonists is the fact of humanity, which is because basically there's nothing an antagonist can do that actually hasn't been done by humanity at some point, which in some senses is pretty dark and bad because of the extremes of what humanity has done. And that's there in the story of Magneto, right? Who witnessed, who was in Auschwitz and obviously, observed something of the Holocaust and everything. And so, that's such a foundation for that character who eventually tries to be good but doesn't work and is basically saying, no, we're all this is going to repeat itself. This is humanity. Where they're going to sort of treat mutants in the same way. They're going to be persecuted and all the rest of it, which does actually happen and everything. Again, coming back,
yes,
saying that is Magneto wrong. So in a way, and no matter how horrendous an antagonist is, it is part of our history. The only thing we haven't done so far is to totally obliterate ourselves. But, there's still time for that. We've only had it's only been the atomic age for, 60 or 70 years or something. So, it's still, there's still every opportunity for that to happen. I'm joking, of course. No one wants that to happen. And we want to move away from that, and hopefully we will. But again, I just want to say that there used to be this whole idea that science fiction and fantasy was like lightweight and all the rest of it. It's just entertainment and all the rest of it. But for me personally, I just like, and I think that attitude has shifted quite a bit with the modern writers and so on. But there's actually, look at the world around you now. So much of what science fiction is talking about is actually coming, is coming. You walk along the street in LA and a robot is delivering a meal and a car drives past and there's no driver in it. And so many other things as well. So this commentary role is so important. It's the commentary on society, the commentary, the ideology we talked about, and your antagonist is right there in the middle of that, playing a really important role, really important point for your antagonist. That's what makes them really interesting, I think.
Well, that is definitely true of fallen heroes and competitor heroes. To some degree of evil masks, always of bullies, corrupt priests, for sure. But I think I'm going to wrap up my comments on antagonists by speaking of the other set, who are less driven by ideology. These being like what I have called a wild beast, a hostile environment, a grand shadow, and to some degree an unstoppable force. The horror movie villain that chases the heroes. I actually, maybe the unstoppable force doesn't belong in this list because I think that is almost always a purity morality play, that the people who sin get killed. And so that unstoppable fate is definitely a characteristic of purity moralities. But I think the Grand Shadow, that's the Sauron character, the Shadow in the North, the Frozen King from Game of Thrones, the just like basically barely distinguishable from a hostile environment. Basically, it is a problem against which we must rally the very best of our resources and pull together, and against which we can set aside our differences. A problem which is not defined by a human face or by a human backstory or need.
Yeah.
The ring wraiths become an unstoppable force that chases the hobbits. It's actually very stoppable. They're a little bit pathetic in practice, but they're a terrifying shadow haunting the characters. And there you might have a wild beast in a similar category, where it's the antagonist. So there's definitely the play of ideologies. And it's probably true that we could sit here and think up fundamental ideological conversation that is happening in the Lord of the Rings, between, especially as inhabited by Saruman, and the ideologies of the hobbits. Saruman versus the hobbits might serve as a core ideological conflict in the Lord of the Rings that actually is playing out in sort of echoed in the conflict between Sauron and the men of Minas Tirith. The conflict between the things which Tolkien sees as good, kindness, food, living in peace with your environment, and which Tolkien sees as bad, modernism, smog producing machines, loud noises, ravaging the landscape in pursuit of some undefinable future goal. But I think, for the most part, I think Tolkien was right about what he thought was good, what he thought was bad. But I do think there is a role in fiction for antagonists who don't have to be there all the time. So in our last 2 minutes, I just want to comment that if you're thinking that your antagonist has to be this like perfect funhouse mirror for the protagonist, that can be really hard to write. Landing on the Joker versus Batman chemistry, that's 1 in a million. We've got very few examples of that. That can be a really high bar to hit. But landing on an antagonist, and all the more so because the Joker versus Batman has had 100 years to develop their relationship, right? It wasn't that way to start with. We've slowly evolved those two characters into this like amazing chemistry that gets used over and over again. But you and the more, when you're trying to do that, you might think that you have to introduce your antagonist really early in your story so that they can be in lots of scenes so that you have a chance to get to know them. But that can be really challenging too. You might not have enough time to build that kind of character. And there are actually a bunch of other ways you can do it, right? The antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be in every scene so that we can get to know them. It can be nice when they are, because that gives us lots of time to get to know them, to, like I was illustrating with my example at the beginning of the hour, to ask whether they're evil or not. That can be a really fun thing to do with an antagonist, is to have them around the whole time so that you're constantly questioning whether they're on your side, letting them betray you, then earn your trust, then betray you, then earn your trust. Like that makes for a great antagonist. But that might not be the kind of story you're writing. It's also okay for your antagonist to be this power that everyone must rally against and to not have a human story.
Absolutely. Definitely. And that can be just as equally compelling and interesting and everything as well. I would say that, just as a final comment, that the great thing that you can do in science fiction and fantasy is take a lot of time with a character. And that really can build interest. I mean, speaking of someone in the midst of writing a trilogy, I'm enthralled and excited by, my particular antagonist has, very strong convictions about how humanity is basically flawed, as evidenced by the fact that we did actually blow ourselves up in this universe. And life is not possible on Earth anymore. Fortunately, we'd managed to get off the planet. So humanity has survived. But just imagining what the mindset would be of people who had seen the obliteration of most of humanity and most civilization on Earth, and that it became uninhabitable. And, some of those people would go in a direction of thinking, well, never again. So how do we ensure never again? And maybe some of them would think that the way to make it never again is just to change the nature of humanity, and they feel as though they have the tools to do it. So
in the corrupt priest category, perhaps.
So yeah, and then how is that going to play out? Are they right? Are they wrong? And so for me, building the arc of that antagonist and through the books and seeing how it does turn out is like enthralling, and the impact it has on the main character as well, of course, and how the main character navigates through that and the consequences is enthralling. So that is one of the great joys, the great sort of things that we can do in science fiction and fantasy is like have long arcs of
Yeah.
character development and story, which
We get to spend a lot of time with people.
yeah,
And I think that's really a big advantage of books, is that there's a lot of pressure to try to get your book quicker, faster, right? To make it more accessible, I guess. But I think that most readers really do want to spend time with characters.
yeah,
Uh, and to live with them for a long time. And that's a big advantage. I mean, if they're attractive characters anyway, if they're interesting and charismatic, then we want to spend time with them. And it's sort of like going back to rewatch Gilmore Girls for the 53rd time, right? Like, yes, I could probably get a more
well, maybe
emotionally overwhelming experience from turning on the latest HBO thing, but sometimes you don't want an emotionally overwhelming experience. Sometimes you just want to watch Gilmore Girls. You want to hang out with your friends, right?
well, yeah,
And there's a place for that in long form fiction.
myself, but
Yeah.
or The Expanse, but whatever. Yeah, but true.
Sometimes you just want to be around these people, right?
Yeah.
And that is a valid
Yeah.
A valid way to tell a narrative, and it's
Yeah.
worth weaving into the narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely. Well, talking about Magneto makes me want to go back and watch the X-Men again as well. So the really good ones you kind of go back to as well,
Yeah.
rewatch and reread, and yeah, because they have value, and they you can see things or appreciate things on each reading or each watching. Which is really great. Right.
Okay, well, this brings us to the end of the hour. Do you have anything that you want to hype?
Yeah, I want to hype that there's this wonderful parallel that's happening between the world of science fiction and fantasy and the real world. And that
is it wonderful?
Well, I was being slightly ironic.
Okay, good. Yeah.
But I think that whatever one thing that I think that encourages me is that I always think back to about 100 and 150 years ago, and 93% of humanity was in some form of a chattel, a kind of mild to greater form of slavery. And if you'd asked those people at that time and told them how the world would be 100 years later, they would really think you were absolutely bonkers and crazy. And when the world was still feudalist and monarchies and all the rest of it, and it was actually the power of writers and thinkers and people and new voices thinking about humanity and inalienable rights and all these different things. And wow, look what happened. The combination of technology was a really, really, really important part of that. It wouldn't happen without the technology. In fact, the technology combined with the ideas is what was really powerful. So the arena of ideas and the exploration of it, and that happens a lot in science fiction. You never know how really powerful it's going to be until it plays out in reality and going into the future. So although we've been talking about antagonists and, humanity destroying itself and all the rest of it, we just don't know. We really just don't know. 50 years, 100 years time, there could be advancement in a world and something that is so much better than we have now, and a lot of sort of our current issues and problems could be solved. I know it doesn't look that way at all, but that's my final thought, that it's so hard to know the future for sure, and the possibilities are just vast.
Reason for hope. Yet another reason to try to read sci-fi. Well, I'm going to be selfish and say, buy my book called Inhuman, IN/human, HUMAN, by Cullen McHael, a cyberpunk fantasy, available from Amazon or from my website at cullenmchale.com. And if you would like to escape for a little while, while we wait for the future to unfold, buy a good sci-fi book and sit down and have an adventure.
And we'll be talking about that in a future episode. Yeah, fellas. Yeah.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for your company.
All right. Yeah, that's it for now. That was great. Thanks a lot.